Welcome to episode 110 of the Girl About the Globe podcast. In this episode, I'm interviewing Julie Kaplan from LA. Julie recently spent 4 months on a solo trip in Iraq, and she's going to give me an insight into visiting this Middle Eastern country. If you've ever been intrigued about traveling to Iraq, this episode is for you. Stay tuned. Welcome to Girl About the Globe, a podcast for you as a solo female traveller, empowering women to travel solo with maximum adventure, minimum impact. Welcome to another podcast episode for the solo female traveller. Today's interview is with Julie Kaplan from LA in America. Julie recently spent 4 months on a solo trip in Iraq and gives us an insight into visiting this Middle Eastern country. Hi, Julie. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, pleasure. I'm so intrigued to speak to you about Iraq because I don't really know anyone else that's been there. But before we delve in, can you just tell us a little bit more about you? When did you first start solo traveling?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So I just graduated from university here in the US.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's been a long time coming, so I was really excited to get my diploma. But so travel has always been something that's been a part of my life. From when I was a kid to present, growing up, my family always encouraged the youngest of my siblings and I, of which there are 4 of us, to be in charge of airport navigation. So from about the time that I was 5, I would go and navigate getting through airport security and finding the gate. And when we were on road trips, the youngest was always in charge of reading the maps.
Oh, I love that.
So that I'm really grateful because from the age of 5 or 6, I was learning directions and how to speak to strangers and how to navigate. And my first solo trip was at the ripe age of 12.
Wow.
Yes. So my grandparents lived on the East Coast of the United States, and Southwest, the airline in the US, you can travel unaccompanied at the age of 12. So I would travel, beginning at the age of 12, I would travel across the country each year to visit my grandparents. And even at that age, being able to travel independently was a massive badge of honor for me. So I would say those early travels really were the catalyst of what has become a life of loving adventure and travel.
That's amazing. And that's such a good skill set to install into somebody, isn't it? Is learning how to navigate and learning how to talk to people and traveling. Because that's not a skill that you generally learn at school, is it? So that's really inspiring that your parents brought you up like that. I'm really intrigued to find out why and what drew you to Iraq.
So that's a great question. I would say the main thing that caught my attention about Iraq is its incredible history. And growing up, I loved reading about the ancient civilizations of Sumeria and Babylon. And it was only relatively recently that I realized modern day Iraq is where those civilizations occurred.
Yeah.
And then as I did more research, I decided to begin a trip to Erbil in South Kurdistan. So that's where my adventure started. But I would say it's the history of Iraq that I've always been interested in. And it's more recent that I realized it's a place I could go visit.
What you just said about Babylon, that is one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world, isn't it? Is it the
Yes, I believe it's one of the 7 ancient wonders, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon.
That's it. Thanks. But that actually isn't in Iraq anymore, is it? It's in one of the museums in Berlin, I believe. But you're so right, because Iraq has got so much history, and all that's really portrayed, or especially coming from the UK, all that I ever really knew about Iraq or ever was shown was obviously the war in Iraq, and it was kind of seen as a no-go country, and I didn't know anything else about it. So it's so great that you've actually been there and you spent 4 months there solo traveling, and that you're going to help inspire us to go there. So you started your travel in Kurdistan, and I know that you now have a YouTube channel where you're documenting all of your travels in Iraq. But was it your goal at the beginning to travel to every major city in Iraq and South Kurdistan before you left for the country?
So, Lisa, what you said before about what you hear about in the kind of in the UK about
Mm,
Iraq is that's very similar to what my experience was, and I think the American perception of Iraq is just so often shaped by the media, which
yeah.
will focus on the country's conflicts and instability. And when I was first in Kurdistan and when I was traveling, to answer your question, it was just so different from what I expected it to be like. And when I arrived, I expected to spend probably a weekend, maybe a week at most, in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. But I was just so amazed by the warmth and hospitality of the locals, the music and dance traditions, the cuisine. Even in a few days, I just felt like there was so much more of the country to explore. And I was so engaged. So after a week in Kurdistan, I decided then to venture into federal Iraq, starting in Baghdad and then going from there. So I totally did not expect to spend all that long in the country, but the reality of the country was just so different from the perception that I previously had that I felt like I just really wanted to learn more and explore more.
I love that. I love that your initial plan was to go for a week, possibly a week and a half, and just do Kurdistan, which is kind of a separate area, isn't it, from Iraq, from what I've read. And I love the fact that you ended up staying 4 months. That's always the best travels, isn't it? And it always gives you the best stories as well. So obviously the people there, as you're speaking, the people there are an important part of your trip. What surprised you about the country and its people?
So it's a great question, and I would say, well, first of all, everything in the country surprised me. I would say the first week, 2 weeks, I was just overwhelmed. But I would say that one of the biggest surprises was how much I had in common with the locals that I met, especially the ones who were my age and who were university students.
Oh,
And is it okay if I tell a quick story?
yeah, of course.
So during Thanksgiving, so that was in November, in Iraq, I celebrated the holiday with a few of my friends in Hilla, which is the city right next to Babylon. And at home in California, we have a little bit of a tradition where at the Thanksgiving dinner table, we all go around and share what we're thankful for. And I asked the same question to my friends in Hilla, and their answers were almost identical to what the answers of my friends and family are at home. They expressed gratitude for God, their families, friends, education, jobs. And that evening was kind of this real realization that despite the fact that these people were raised across the entire world, what their values and what's important to them is almost identical to what we have at home. So I think, although there are differences, I think I was just really astounded by how much I have in common, how much I had in common.
Oh, that's really heartwarming as well, isn't it? That's something that I notice on whenever I travel solo and I meet the local people, because I think you get a chance to immerse yourself more within the culture when you're solo. And is that we all have the same needs and we all have the same wants. And it's just our culture or our conditioning and the way that we're brought up that makes us different. But deep down, like you're saying, we all want to feel connected to something, whether that's God, the universe. We all want security. We all want protection. We all want like love from family and friends. So that's so amazing that you met people the same age as you and that you connected with them on the same values that you have.
I couldn't agree with you more.
But not being a mainstream destination, first of all, what kind of reactions did you get from people when you said that you were going to Iraq? Were they concerned about you traveling to the country?
Definitely. I
Yeah.
think the gut reaction of a lot of my friends and family when I told them that I was going to Iraq, or for some when I was already there, I think a lot of them were They were surprised, they were worried for me, and I don't blame them actually, because again, the media that they've seen, the most recent time they had heard about Iraq was in 2015, 16, 17, when
Mm.
ISIS was in the country, and before that it was to the 2003 invasion. I would say that people's opinions of the country have really been colored by decades of war. To be totally honest, a lot of my friends and family were worried for me, they were fearful, and when I was telling them what I was seeing on the ground, they were just as surprised as I initially was. So, I think a lot of my friends and family had a lot of misconceptions, and I'm just glad that I got to share with them, and I got to film a video series that ultimately became my honors university thesis. And as now I've
Amazing.
which I'm really, really proud of. And that series is such a treasure, and I'm so excited by it because I get to show all of my friends and family what I saw on the ground, the hospitality of the people, the bazaars, the architecture, the history. They get to see Iraq not through news articles, but through my perspective and my experience. So they definitely had some kind of thoughts about the country before I arrived and when I first got there. But as I've gotten to share, I think that I've helped change some of their outlooks a little bit.
That's fantastic. And I was looking at some of your videos and reading some of the comments, and you've got some really good feedback, especially from people who live in Iraq. Some of the comments were saying, thank you so much for showing this side of our country and for showing how welcoming we are and for portraying the reality of it. And I know that when I go to a place and I blog about it, I just write about it. So because you're actually doing it in a video, you're bringing it more to life than you can ever really get from just reading an article, which is still kind of seen through your own eyes and your own perceptions of what you imagine it to be like. But because you've actually been on the ground and you've done a whole video series, you're showing the reality of the country as it is. And I think that's fantastic. How many videos have you got in your series? And tell us a bit more about that.
Definitely. What was awesome about my trip and filming the videos was how the locals that I met were so engaged, and everybody I met seemed to be happy to help me on my quest to show the world kind of Iraq through my eyes.
Mm.
So every step along the way, I had so many locals to help. I filmed more than 10 videos when I was there. And what's been awesome is from planning the video to filming it to editing it after I came home. Every step along the way, I've been working with the friends that I made, making sure that the story I'm telling is accurate because there are a lot of facts that I put in. So I've had so much help. But in my video series, the goal was for each episode, which is anywhere from about 5 to 20 minutes, to tell a story. And in one of my episodes, the mission was to learn how to play the oud in Basra, Iraq. And the oud is an instrument similar to the guitar. And in another video, the goal for the day was to go build a snowman in Erbil. To which many of my friends and family had said, Julie, I had no idea there was snow in Iraq.
Yeah.
So that was, yeah. So my series was definitely, it would not have been possible without all of the help of the locals that I met along the way, and they've helped every step. But yeah, so that's a little bit more about my video series.
Right, and I'll put a link in the interview as well. I was going to ask you, how did you feel traveling around Iraq? But I think you've just answered that, because it seems as though you felt very welcomed and very accepted, and everyone was really helpful. And that was the feeling that you had throughout the whole country in Iraq and both Kurdistan as well.
Yeah. So I'm very fortunate. I did not run into any security issues. I will say there are challenges that come with traveling in Iraq, especially as a solo female. Um, Going from city to city, there are checkpoints that you have to navigate, and there are areas, especially in the north and in the south of the country, that rarely see solo female tourists. So I wouldn't say traveling through the country was 100% seamless and easy. It definitely took some resilience. It took a lot of following your gut instincts. It took some Arabic and Kurdish abilities, of which I learned when I was there. I can pick up languages pretty easily, so I learned enough to get by. Traveling around, I did feel safe. I never felt like I was in danger, but this is a place where your brain has to always be on. It's definitely one of the more challenging destinations that I've been to.
I think that makes it more rewarding though, doesn't it? When you finish a trip, when you have a country like that really need to be, mentally vigilant in, and it is a challenge. It really makes it so rewarding, especially if you're doing it by yourself.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it was a great combination of when I was traveling and there were challenges, I never really felt like I was in danger. So it was kind of a great mixture of it was challenging, it was difficult, but I was safe. And I think that was a really cool combination.
Yeah, very important as well. Because there are now quite a few tour companies that offer tours to Iraq. Did you ever consider taking a group tour, or you just wanted to go to Kurdistan and just be there solo?
Honestly, until arriving in Iraq, I wasn't aware that group tours were even a possibility. But I think even if I knew, I don't think I would have joined in on one. I always prefer venturing out on my own. And as a solo female traveler, as I'm sure other people on your podcast have talked about, the experiences that I think are pretty different from what a group tour can offer, whether that's the
Definitely.
freedom to navigate uncharted paths and embrace spontaneous adventures. That's what gets me excited about travel.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I do think group tours are a great option for some, but I think I'll be sticking to my solo escapades.
Definitely, solo travel is more of an adventure, isn't it? And how did you navigate the checkpoints by yourself? Did you have to have a local with you to get over the checkpoints, or you were okay just by yourself?
So it's a good question, and each checkpoint was a little bit different. But I would say in general, I was okay on my own. Again, I did learn bits and pieces of Arabic to be able to communicate, and I had a lot of friends who I met who I would be able to call, who were happy to explain to kind of the checkpoint military officers that I was in the country for a good reason. I was a friend. I'm a tourist. So having locals on the ground, I would say, is the most integral part of traveling to Iraq. So that's how I got through checkpoints.
That's good advice. And how did you even begin to start planning a trip to Iraq? I know you'd started in Kurdistan and then you said you went down to Baghdad. I recently spoke to a tour company who operate tours in Iraq, and they said that in regards to the visas, you can, especially on a UK passport, I'm presuming it's the same for the US, is that when you go to Kurdistan, it's very easy to get into the country. You don't need to apply for a visa beforehand. I think you just get a visa on arrival. But then when you try and enter Iraq from Kurdistan, it can be a bit difficult. So it's better to go from Iraq to Kurdistan afterwards. Did you encounter any problems in regards to going from Kurdistan to Iraq?
That's a great question. And if anybody's listening to this, I would recommend to read up on what the current requirements are. For me, I had to fly from Erbil to Baghdad, even though it probably would have been faster to just drive. I had to fly and then get a separate visa. So it was a little bit complicated, but it definitely was possible.
And Erbil is the capital of Kurdistan, isn't it?
Yes, it's the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan.
Iraqi Kurdistan. Okay. And how did you plan your trip? So once you arrived in Baghdad, what was your itinerary? And did you just meet locals and then they said, "Oh, you should go to this area"? And did you just kind of make it up as you went along?
Yeah, so when I arrived in Baghdad, I made a bunch of friends who were college aged, and I had them walk me through what each region of the country was like and whether it was worth it to visit 5 cities, 10 cities, what their ideal itinerary would be. And they very much encouraged me to see the country from north to south. So it was definitely locals who inspired my itinerary. And I ended up visiting pretty much every major city in the country. So in the Kurdistan region, I visited Erbil, Lalish, Dahok, Acre, and Slimani. And then in federal Iraq, I visited pretty much every city from Mosul in the north to Basra in the south. So it was definitely when I got to Baghdad that first time, I did lots of travel planning and had a rough itinerary. And then sometimes I would meet a friend or there would be a reason to deviate off path. But that was how I did it.
And how did you get around? What's the public transport like there?
There was very little there weren't that many buses. I will say there was an awesome train that I took from Baghdad to Basra. So I took an overnight train a few times to get from Baghdad to the south of the country. But in general, in my day-to-day life, I traveled via car. When I was traveling from city to city, I used shared taxis. And then in kind of day-to-day travels when exploring a city, I had locals who showed me around and who took me along in their car. So it's very much 99% of the time I was in a car, and then 1% of the time I took the train.
That's amazing that you took the overnight train there. Was it quite comfortable?
Oh, it definitely it was a lot more comfortable than you might think. And what was great about that train ride is one of the times I took it, I met a wonderful woman in my cabin named Amira, who ultimately she was staying in my 4-person sleeper car. And I ended up staying with her and her family for a few days because I didn't have there was a gap in which I didn't have a place to stay. And somebody who I met in that train welcomed me in, which is something that happened time and time again during my trip.
Amazing. I've heard that Iranians are meant to be the most friendliest nation, but it does also sound like Iraqis are also equally just as hospitable and welcoming. The Middle Eastern culture generally is very giving and welcoming and accepting you in, and it sounds as though that's the kind of experience that you had in Iraq.
Definitely. And I found that the less touristy an area is, the warmer people are. And it was really
Interesting.
special to get to stay with people. And just as I learned from them, a lot of people had never met somebody from California. And I got to share as well. So I think, and I'm sure you've had experiences like this as well,
Mm.
especially in the Middle East, where I learn from the people I meet, and then hopefully they learn a little bit from me too. And that's one of, I think, a great type of exchange and encounter to have.
Definitely. It's like a cultural exchange, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you said that there weren't really any other solo female travelers that you met, but what did you meet any other travelers at all?
Yes. So there definitely weren't that many solo female travelers. I can think of maybe one or two that I ran across. But the most valuable resource for tourists in Iraq that I found, and this is not a sponsored, I'm not saying this for any sponsorship reasons, is there's a Facebook group called the Iraqi Travelers Cafe. And
Oh,
if somebody's thinking about going to Iraq, I would totally recommend joining the group. And it's where prospective travelers or current travelers send messages and make posts in the chat. And then locals who are interested in meeting foreigners or showing them around will reply and provide advice, or if people are in a pinch, they'll help. So that forum is where I got a lot of, especially before I arrived and hadn't made friends yet, that's where I got a lot of initial pieces of advice.
and what was the name of that Facebook group again?
It's called the Iraqi Travelers Cafe.
Right, I will also put that in the show notes as well. What would your must-sees be in the country? Obviously, you've seen all of the major cities there, so you must have such a in-depth knowledge of traveling around. What would your must-sees be?
Mm. Um, I think the prerequisite is I don't know if I'm a complete expert, but I know the favorite places that I visited. I loved Mosul in the north. There, I thought the cuisine was world class. And one of my favorite, perhaps less visited cities that I went to is a town called Lawlish, and this is in in South Kurdistan, and it's a sacred place for the Yazidi faith. And the Yazidis are a religious and ethnic group, and I was there during their annual fall festival, where thousands of Yazidis from around the world came to visit. And the Yazidism is a religion that I just didn't know very much about before I went to Lawlish, and a lot of them let me in on their traditions and their cuisine and what they believe in, and that was a really, really special place to visit, and they couldn't be more welcoming towards me, who is not a Yazidi, and they were really, really welcoming towards me. So if somebody's thinking about visiting Iraq or South Kurdistan, I loved Mosul, which is in the north, but I also really, really enjoyed Lawlish.
Oh, fantastic. And which other areas did you also think might appeal to people traveling there for the first time?
I would say another real highlight for me was the Mesopotamian marshes. So this is
Hmm.
in Nasriya, which is in the south of the country, and I thought so. This is the largest wetland ecosystem in the Middle East, and I just have never seen any natural any kind of area of nature quite like it. I think a lot of the time when people think about the Middle East, they don't think about they picture the desert when in reality
Yeah.
Iraq has mountains, it has snow, it has lakes. But I really loved the marshes.
You were saying earlier about the history, and would you say that that is the main attraction to go to Iraq?
Mm, Perhaps for many it would be the main reason to go, but I really think that Iraq has something for everyone. So if they're interested in history, there are more than enough ruins and historic places to keep you busy for a few weeks. But Iraq has so much nature. The cuisine is world class. There's a lot of really beautiful architecture and interesting mosques. So I would say history even if history isn't at the forefront of what a prospective traveler is interested in, there's more than enough there are yeah, more than enough other activities to keep somebody busy.
And is there anywhere that you would avoid in the country? I know you said that you felt safe, but are there any areas that you think maybe you don't really need to go to?
So that's a really important and good question. And I would say that there are two kind of things that I would avoid if I were advising somebody who's about to travel to Iraq. First, remote and isolated areas I wouldn't venture into. I would stick to the cities and well traveled routes. And it's pretty easy to stay in all of the cities because in general, that's where the people are. But I would say really remote areas I wouldn't venture into. And then, second, any, it's my general rule anyway when traveling to avoid public demonstrations, protests. If any of those are occurring, I would stay in my hotel or avoid them. These kind of situations can be pretty unpredictable and can escalate. So I avoid them. So I would say though those are the two that my instincts say to avoid.
That's a really good tip, actually, about the demonstrations. Yeah, that's really important. What would you say to someone who's looking to go to Iraq alone for the first time and is unsure about it?
This is a great question. I love answering questions like this. Um, if somebody were going to Iraq for the first time, this is what I would say. I would say first, keep an open mind. embrace the unique experiences that Iraq has to offer, engage with locals. I would say that's first. And then second, I would say make sure to bring enough cash with you. Credit cards are not always accepted. ATMs aren't always available. So I would always have I always keep US dollars on my person, but local currency works as well. Next, I would say safety, always a top priority. Stay informed, read the news, communicate with those around you, and make sure that there's, that everything on the ground is looking good. And then finally, I would say, prepare yourself for an adventure like no other. There are so many incredible sights to see. Allow yourself to be immersed in the country's beauty, and get ready for a great time. And I hope and a happy travels. That's what I would say.
Great advice. Iraq does seem as though it's a country for historical solo or cultural experience, and obviously for the food lover as well. How would you describe Iraq in 3 words?
Iraq in 3 words. I would say enchanting, historic, resilient.
Great words. And have you stayed in touch with some of the people that you met there?
Every single day.
Fantastic. And what are your plans for the future? Are you planning to go back to the Middle East?
I would love to visit the Middle East again. It's on my list. Up next, I'm planning on visiting Central America. So I'm planning on flying to Costa Rica in about a week and a half. So although I hope to return to the Middle East one day, it's not up next. So I'll be spending the summer traveling before beginning a full-time work position in San Francisco in October.
Well, Central America sounds great. You'll have an amazing time there. Very different from the Middle East. It'll be a good experience. And where can people go to find out more about you and watch your amazing video series?
Thank you. So where you can find me is my username is Julie from LA, and you can find me on YouTube and on Instagram. And LA stands for Los Angeles, for those of you wondering.
Brilliant. So I'll put a link to your YouTube series and your Instagram on the interview. Thank you so much, Julie, for joining us today. And I personally wanted to interview you because I wanted to know more about Iraq, but it's great that you are showing the reality of this country and just how welcoming it is. And I wish you every success in the future.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Those are really, really kind words, and it was wonderful to speak with you today.
And you can follow Julie's video series on YouTube. Just search for Julie from LA. And I'll be back next week with another episode. Thanks for listening to our Girl About the Globe podcast, making solo travel easier for you. Find everything that you need for your solo travels at girlabouttheglobe.com, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode.